Okay, so we're just going to work our way through the manual. And the first topic, we're going to try and hit 3 topics today. The first topic we're going to take a look at is basically Chapter 1. I just worked my way through the manual. We're going to take a look at Chapter 1, which is to do with constitutional interpretation. Now you can take a look at the sheet in your own time as to how this has come up in the past. This guy hasn't really examined constitutional interpretation as a topic on its own. And what it is, before we go into it, is what's happened in constitutional interpretation is that if any of you look at the Constitution, you'll see that all the detail isn't there. It'll just include a general statement, such as the dwelling of a person is inviolable save in accordance with law. But what a dwelling means, what forcibly means, what inviolability means, save in accordance with law, what that means, the Constitution doesn't tell you. So it's up to the judges to decide what these terms mean. And when the judges are trying to hear cases and decide what these terms mean, they have developed what are called methods of constitutional interpretation. So what these methods are different guides for judges. When they're asked to interpret something in the Constitution, these guides assist them in carrying out that role. That's why they're called methods of constitutional interpretation. Now, the previous guy has examined these as a question on methods of constitutional interpretation. But he's never just said, write everything you know or discuss the methods of constitutional interpretation. He's fudged it a bit. And what he tends to do is he tends to argue that these methods of constitutional interpretation aren't keeping subjectivity out, that they're allowing judges to manipulate the Constitution to suit the meaning that they want to give words. Okay? So he's never going to give you a write all about the methods of constitutional interpretation. There's going to be an angle on it. The usual angles are that they don't keep out judicial subjectivity. Okay, or the other angle, this is on that outline sheet that I gave you, or else what they can argue is, are they a means of judicial restraint? Do the methods of constitutional interpretation force judges to justify any interpretation they make of the Constitution? Okay, now we're going to go into them now in a minute. This is just setting the scene for you before we go into the topic, and I'd like you to keep these ideas in your head as we go through them. The other way he's done this time is he honed in particular on natural law. Now, natural law comes up in various parts of the course. It'll come up a good bit when we come to the right side of the course. But it has also been used as a means of interpreting constitutional rights. So it'll be dealt with briefly as part of constitutional interpretation, but then it actually will be dealt with in greater detail when we're looking at personal rights under the Constitution. So we're going to kickstart with looking at these methods of constitutional interpretation. While the book just lays them out one method after another, remember this guy is not going to examine that. There will be some angle on it that essentially involves you discussing the methods of constitutional interpretation, but either to prove a point that they do rule out judicial subjectivity or to prove that they don't rule out judicial subjectivity, whatever you believe. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is what the manual, you can take a read of this paragraph yourself because it is what I've just discussed with you. 101 there. Restraint. That these methods of constitutional interpretation, that they effectively act as a means of restraining judges, of forcing judges when they interpret the Constitution to justify how they have interpreted the Constitution. That you don't have a judge, we'll say, saying, well, I don't want there to be same-sex marriages, so I'm going to arrive at an interpretation of marriage under the Constitution that rules that out. By forcing him to justify whatever interpretation he makes of the word marriage, you're hoping that you can rule out judicial subjectivity. The judge can't just give an interpretation that he wants because he's going to have to justify whichever interpretation he gives. Now, does everyone understand what I'm talking about when I'm talking about judicial restraint and keeping out judicial subjectivity? That's what I've said is explained to you in 101. Now we're going to take a look at the various methods. Well, one method that is used is called the literal approach. Now, these are various methods that have been developed by judges, okay? Now, the literal approach does exactly what it says. It means giving words their literal meaning. So whatever is the plain, ordinary meaning of a word in the Constitution, that's the meaning the judge gives it. So if a judge is asked to interpret a word and he decides that the appropriate method is literal interpretation, what he is going to do is just give that word its plain, ordinary meaning. Now we're going to take a look at one or two cases in the manual which show you this at play. And one of the first here is the People DPP versus O'Shea. Now what happened here was there was an article 34.4.3 which we will look at separately, which the judge was being asked to interpret. And what he basically, the issue in the case was he was being asked to decide whether, if you were acquitted before the High Court, could the prosecution appeal that acquittal to the Supreme Court. Okay? Now normally the rule is that if you're acquitted, that's it, end of case, you walk free. The problem was that the article in the Constitution, 34.4.3, which deals with appeals to the Supreme Court, said that the Supreme Court, if you take a look at it there, we're at page 2 of the manual, the Supreme Court shall, jump down a bit, have appellate jurisdiction from all decisions of the High Court. So if you give a literal interpretation to the word all, that is going to include decisions of the High Court where a person has been acquitted. But that went against another principle which we'll deal with later in constitutional law called double jeopardy. Okay? Now, and what happens here is, so the court had to decide the interpretation of that word. And they basically said, if you jump up to the top of 104, paragraph 104, here it says that the judge used the literal rule, which means that you give words their ordinary, everyday meaning. The Constitution, as the fundamental law of the state, must be accepted, interpreted and construed according to the words which are used. And these words, where the meaning is plain and unambiguous, must be given their literal meaning. Okay? Now, he does acknowledge, however, that the Constitution is a whole document. It can't be necessarily looked at in isolation. And then he says the Constitution must be looked at as a whole and not merely in parts. And where doubt or ambiguity exists, regard may be had to other provisions within the Constitution. Jump down a bit. Plain words must, however, be given their plain meaning unless qualified or restricted by the Constitution itself. Now, it's the last sentence there that summarises the whole principle, and that's the key one. So what was being said in the O'Shea case is you give words their plain meaning. However, if it looks ambiguous, if the meaning of the word looks ambiguous, then you have to go outside that article and the ordinary meaning of the word and look elsewhere to try and find the meaning. Okay? So what the literal method involves using is plain, ordinary meaning. But if there's some doubt about that meaning, you have to go outside and look elsewhere. Okay? So words like High Court, that you could use the literal interpretation there because the High Court is specifically defined. There's only one entity called the High Court. So any references in the Constitution to the High Court, we can assume it's to the one entity that's called the High Court. However, there's other words in the Constitution that will not be able to be defined just on the basis of their literal meaning because it has an impact, and we'll see that later. Now, Casey has raised an issue you'll see there in your manual where he said that often if you just look at a word on its own, its meaning looks plain. But if you go off and look at other provisions within the Constitution, the meaning is no longer plain. Remember what was said in O'Higgins, that if the meaning is plain, you stick to the word within the section. It's only if it's unclear that you move outside the section. But what Casey is saying is that the lack of clarity might only materialise when you look outside the section. Okay, everyone all right on that? Now, then what's happened is some people rejected, some judges